Welcome into another reaction video. I'm Alex. Today we're going to be taking a quick break from our look at Brandon F's analysis of The Patriot. We will be getting back to that, but right now I wanted to dive into one of my favorite channels here on YouTube, House of History. For years, House of History has been one of the best channels out there covering the history of Germany, Prussia, Austria, topics such as those, but in recent years and months has expanded its scope and increased its production quality. And I want to take a look today at one of their more recent videos on the Battle of Penang from the First World War, October 28th, 1914. Let's dive in.
It is summer 1914. The First World War raged on in Europe. To the east, a German light cruiser entered the Bay of Bengal, navigating the Molucca and Buru Straits and the Banda Sea with calculated precision. Hindered by Dutch neutrality, its captain's audacious plan unfolded. Capitalizing on British...
Now, I believe he actually might be talking here about the Malacca Strait. Let me take a quick look. Okay, so here's what I'm talking about. He may be referring to the Molucca Sea, which is over here to the west of the Molucca Islands or the Spice Islands, or he could be referring to the Strait of Malacca, which I believe is likely what he's referring to here, because this is obviously the Battle of Penang. So we'll find out here, I guess, in a minute.
Fusion, Emden achieved tactical surprise, disguised ingeniously as a British cruiser. The bay, typically a hub of peacetime maritime activity, unsuspectingly bore witness to Emden's predation. The Emden, under Captain Karl von Müller's command, went on to have one of the most famous cruises of the war. Amidst the geopolitical tumult of the early 20th century, the fate of German cruisers played a pivotal role in the theater of war. In 1914, Germany strategically deployed its naval assets overseas.
Okay, and the reason for that is because, remember, back in Europe, Britain ends up imposing a naval blockade in the North Sea, and that it basically hems Germany in. Of course, there's one battle, the Battle of Jutland, where the Germans try to break out of the Baltic into the North Sea. They're unsuccessful. It ends in a draw, but it's effectively a British victory because the Germans are unable to break out. And that blockade eventually essentially starves Germany into submission by 1918. So the decision to send most of their naval assets abroad was so that they could actually be used rather than being hemmed in by the British blockade.
Including Vice Admiral Maximilian Count von Spee's East Asiatic Squadron, comprising the Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Emden, Leipzig, and Nuremberg.
And Admiral von Spee will go on to perish in a battle against the British off the Falkland Islands over in the Atlantic, a battle that I believe House of History has also recently covered.
Concurrently, due to colonial and strategic considerations, other cruisers like the Königsberg, Dresden, and Karlsruhe were dispatched to far-flung regions. The German plan envisioned cruiser warfare against enemy vessels, raiding coasts, bombarding military establishments, and disrupting communication infrastructure. Each cruiser captain bore the responsibility of independent decision-making, guided by the imperative to inflict maximum damage upon the enemy. Von Spee, in particular, received orders to maintain the squadron's freedom of movement and not fall into the trap of a blockade. Meanwhile, the Admiralty redirected their efforts, leaving Tsingtao exposed. They felt confident in entrusting the protection of British trade in the northern regions, including Hong Kong, to their Japanese allies.
True, and I think it's oftentimes forgotten that the First World War was in fact a world war because of the outsized focus that gets placed on the Western Front of the European theater. There was fighting all around the world. In fact, let's take a look. Okay, so here's a general overview of the Southeast Asian and Pacific theaters on the eve of the First World War. I think a lot of times that, especially here in America, All the attention goes, of course, to the Pacific Theater in the Second World War, but it's important to remember there was a Pacific Theater in World War I as well. In fact, there were theaters all over the world. There was fighting in Africa, fighting throughout the seas, just as there was in the Second World War. So here is the Southeast Asian and Pacific theaters on the eve of World War I. Germany was quite isolated, as all of the other great powers in the Pacific were either neutral or joined the Allies. And so that left Germany, as we just said, with some choices to make. So they were based over here in Tsingtao. And again, they had some decisions to make with all of these territories that they held in the Central Pacific, which would end up being taken by Japan and then would become part of the main body of the fighting in World War II as the Americans try to take them from the Japanese. But this battle, of course, we're focusing here on Southeast Asia. And so let's zoom in over there. This is Penang Island right here. Here's the Straits of Malacca. So going back to that opening scene, I think we can probably assume that it was the Germans sailing through the Strait of Malacca here to try to break into the Indian Ocean. But actually, let's take a closer look at this area. Okay, so here's a little more detail of the area we're talking about. This is actually from the video we did over on the Wayback History channel about Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 that went missing. We did a little background on the history of Penang, which was the birthplace of the pilot. You see it's dated 1939, but essentially the situation was the same in 1914. So this is basically what we're looking at here. This is Penang Island. This was the first possession that the British took in Southeast Asia. And so it became basically a hub of British power and influence in Southeast Asia. And they expanded out from there. This mainland territory attached is called the province of Wellesley. And there's a major harbor right on the channel side of Penang Island. And that has a fort there as well called Fort Cornwallis. That was named after General Cornwallis, again calling back to the Patriot, where, of course, Lord Cornwallis is a main character. He actually went to India to work after the American War of Independence and died in India, Penang having been held in its early days by the British East India Company. But at this point, it was part of the British Straits settlements, which included Penang, Malacca, which was a Portuguese and later Dutch possession, and, of course, Singapore, which was eventually developed into the commercial center that it turned into today. But we're talking about Penang Island right here and the harbor at Penang. And again, here is the Strait of Malacca, which has always been one of the key choke points in global geopolitics and continues to be today.
The consequences of these decisions were profound. They inadvertently allowed von Spee to slip through the blockade. He altered their plans, opting for a clandestine voyage to the west coast of America.
And that's where he ends up, of course, off of Chile and then later the Falklands, where he meets his end. But that's a story for another day.
Emden departed soon after. Captain of the Emden, Karl von Müller's initial actions included patrolling the shipping lanes between Vladivostok and Nagasaki. It was August 4th when he captured the Russian steamer Roasa. It was Germany's first captured vessel of the war. Müller converted it into the auxiliary cruiser Cormoran. Then he sailed to rendezvous with Spee, who was organizing a journey eastward at Pagan Island. On August 12th, the Emden rendezvoused with the East Asiatic Fleet at Pagan. In the face of an extended Pacific cruise, Müller raised doubts, instead advocating for the detachment of a light cruiser to the Indian Ocean, a notion promptly endorsed by Admiral von Spee. It was decided the Emden would venture into the Indian Ocean, disrupting trade and acquiring coal from captured prizes.
And so that's how they'll end up in the Strait of Malacca, which is right over here, and there is Penang.
The Prince Eitel Friedrich and Cormoran were dispatched to Australian waters, although Spee had limited expectations for their success due to their lower speed and higher coal consumption. The rest of the squadron sailed eastward from Pagan on August 13th. On November 7th, Tsingtao fell to a combined Japanese-British attack.
And again, I may have been critical of Brandon F. in his analysis of the Patriot, but he recently did a fantastic video on this siege of Tsingtao, which is totally worth checking out.
British Vice Admiral Martin Jerram of the East India Squadron, now free to pursue the German forces, faced uncertainties, especially about the whereabouts of the entire German East Asiatic Squadron. Meanwhile, Müller planned to enter the Indian Ocean through the Molucca and Buru Straits and the Banda Sea.
So that's actually interesting because, of course, here he's got the Strait of Malacca highlighted. But over here, this is a little bit to the west. The Maluku Sea is right over here. So, I guess in theory it could be both. But I do believe that that opening scene was referring to the Strait of Malacca off of Penang Island.
Avoiding the usual steamer routes. However, the Dutch enforced their neutrality rigorously, serving as a brake on German freedom of action.
Yep. So the Dutch are neutral in the First World War. Of course, in the Second World War, they get involved. The Dutch East Indies are a big part of that after the mainland Netherlands get taken over by Germany. But in the First World War, Germany avoids touching the mainland Netherlands, and thus the Dutch East Indies remain neutral. However, as he just said, it's a fighting neutrality, so the Germans are trying their best to avoid detection.
Still, he succeeded. Müller, capitalizing on British confusion and their assumption he was sailing east with the German East Asiatic Squadron, achieved complete tactical surprise as he emerged in the Bay of Bengal.
That's what he's hoping
The
for.
bay, typically a hub of normal peacetime maritime activity, had resumed its routine traffic without anticipating the presence or likelihood of a raider.
In these trade routes in the Bay of Bengal, the rest of the Indian Ocean rim down into Southeast Asia and the Spice Islands have been lucrative free trade routes for centuries upon centuries. And they've essentially remained that way for the better part of really over 2,000 years, whether it be just local kingdoms involved, whether it be outside powers. Of course, the Greeks were there at one point. You had the Europeans later coming back in the last several centuries and dominating. There was a period where the Arabs were getting involved, the Turks, even the Mongols at one point.
Emden, disguised ingeniously with a false funnel to masquerade as a British cruiser, proved a formidable predator.
So we've already seen on a couple of occasions that a big part of what the Germans are doing here is deception.
Under the cover of darkness on September 10th, the Greek collier Pontoporos, laden with British government freight, fell victim to the Emden. Recognizing the strategic value of the captured vessel, Müller decided to convert the Greek collier into a collier for Emden's use. In a surprising turn of events, the captain and crew of the Pontoporos willingly joined Müller's crew in exchange for compensation, aligning their fate with the marauding German cruiser. Emden's subsequent forays unfolded over the ensuing days. Emden seized control of 5 British vessels. Of the captured ships, 4 met a watery demise, consigned to the depths. The 5th vessel, commandeered by Müller, reluctantly served as a carrier for the crews of the sunken prizes. In a relentless pursuit of disruption, Müller extended his dominion over the maritime expanse. Moving northward, Emden reached the Ganges estuary by September 18th. Then, an Italian ship, temporarily detained and subsequently released by Emden, unwittingly became...
And the Italians in this war are, at this point in 1914, neutral. They eventually will join the Allied side. They had a defensive pact with Austria and Germany, but as they were the parties that started the war, that pact was null and void, and Italy, wanting territories from Austria, ends up joining the Allies. But at this point, they're a neutral state.
Messenger heralding the German warship's presence to a British steamer. The Admiralty, belatedly realizing the threat posed by Emden, detained vessels in the Bay of Bengal, though von Müller had already secured his coal supplies for the impending hunt. Caught amidst the chaos of troop transports, Jerram swiftly mobilized naval assets in pursuit of Emden.
So now, Jerram finally realizes something is going on, but nobody in the Bay of Bengal was ready for this, and so Müller has basically been shooting fish in a barrel.
Hampshire, the Japanese light cruiser Chikuma and Yarmouth were dispatched to quell the maritime menace. Simultaneously, the armored cruiser Minotaur set course for the west coast of Sumatra, and the Japanese cruiser Ibuki headed to the Cocos Islands, anticipating Emden's potential refueling stops.
And with all the European powers having to make these choices on what they want to deploy abroad, the Japanese really are in the position to take advantage of the situation in Asia and the Pacific, and eventually they do. Obviously, with the siege of Tsingtao, they seize the islands in the Central Pacific and the South Seas. So the Japanese here on the Allied side are a major presence for the Allies in this theater.
As Emden cruised near Rangoon on September 18th, while British cruisers scoured the northern waters in search of Emden, Muller veered westward, charting a course straight for Madras. The element of surprise played into Emden's hands as it approached the unsuspecting city on September 22nd. In a dramatic night assault, Emden, aided by the illuminated buoys and city lights, unleashed a 10-minute barrage on Madras.
Wow.
The oil tanks erupted in flames, steamers were damaged and one was sunk. The impact was profound, halting shipping in the Bay of Bengal once more.
And a big part of this is the British are just now starting to come to terms with what the situation is. The Japanese unable to catch Muller, and that is a big win, destroying many of the facilities at a major port in Madras.
His uncanny streak of good fortune persisted. Evading pursuers, the cruiser altered its course, rounding Colombo's southern tip on September 24th. The ensuing days witnessed a spree of sinkings, captures, and strategic decisions by Muller, further complicating the maritime landscape. Realizing the need to deflect suspicion and replenish resources, Emden set a course for the Maldive Islands.
And you've got to remember how slow communication was in 1914 as well. So even though some of the Allied fleet is starting to become aware of what's going on, plenty of British assets and other Allied assets, you think about the port in Madras, you think about those ships over in the sea near Ceylon, all probably had no idea what was coming.
Leaving in its wake a disrupted Indian Ocean trade and 14 sunk vessels. On October 2nd, she arrived in Diego Garcia.
Diego Garcia, still a British possession today, now part of the British Indian Ocean Territory, where there's a major British and American base. Extremely strategic position in the southern Indian Ocean.
This seemingly oblivious outpost, news of the war between Britain and Germany had yet to arrive.
There you go.
The welcoming reception allowed Emden to undergo essential maintenance and refueling for a week. On October 10th, Commander von Muller, undeterred, charted a course west of Colombo, evading the pursuing British cruiser Hampshire, which misjudged Emden's location. Seizing and sinking a British ship near Minicoy on October 15th, Emden continued its raiding spree, sinking vessels and employing diversions. In total, another 5 vessels were captured or sunk up to October 20th. The British naval units, in a relentless pursuit, orchestrated a multifaceted effort to locate and neutralize Emden. Hampshire cruised south of Ceylon, Yarmouth escorted French transports off Colombo, Chaikuma monitored the Strait of Malacca, and the Russian cruiser Jemchug ventured from Penang to the...
So now the Allies are out in full force looking for Muller. But at the same time, it's pretty amazing how, again, with the lack of communication in 1914, there's plenty of other places and ships that have no idea what's coming and are easy targets for Muller. But now he's being fully hunted.
Maldive Islands in search of potential German coaling bases. Emden's recurrent ability to elude its pursuers left the British Naval Command disheartened, prompting questions in prominent publications such as the London Times about the Admiralty's strategies. Meanwhile, fueled by an unbroken streak of fortune, Muller, urged by one of his lieutenants, resolved to gamble on a clandestine assault on Penang. His anticipation was set on discovering Allied warships and cargo vessels nestled in the harbor, ready to be thrown into chaos. He resolved...
And so now he's sailing right into the heart of the Royal Navy in Southeast Asia, right in this critical choke point at the Strait of Malacca and into, again, their heart at the harbor of Penang. So Muller Again, very bold, as the Allies have thus far been unable to catch him.
To deal a devastating blow against the Allied powers. After coaling at Nankore, Emden sailed for Penang on the night of October 28th, adopting deceptive measures with a dummy funnel to approach the harbor at dawn.
More deception from the Germans, and that's a big part of how they've been able to pull this off so far.
In the pre-dawn darkness of October 28th, Captain Karl von Müller executed his deception, propelling the Emden toward Penang at 20 knots, augmented by a fabricated wooden and canvas funnel to mimic an English cruiser. This ingenious ruse fooled the unsuspecting patrol launch, allowing the Emden to slip past undetected. Little did the Allied forces suspect the tempest about to be unleashed upon their unsuspecting harbor. The entry was facilitated by lights, including those at the entrance, casting an eerie glow. As the sun ascended, it revealed the roadstead's commercial vessels. Nearing the warship anchorage, Muller's attention was seized by 4 luminous lights. At a distance of 1,200 yards, they resolved into the quarterdeck lights of a warship, later identified as the Russian cruiser Jemchug.
And so here's what we're talking about at the beginning. So here's Fort Cornwallis over here on the island side, over on Penang Island. Here's the mainland side of the territory. And then here's this protected harbor in the channel where all of these warships are gathered.
The Russian crew was unaware and dormant. Remarkably, a Russian sailor aboard the Jemchug, as recounted in the Siam Observer on November 9, 1914, witnessed the foreign warship's ominous approach. When challenged, the mysterious vessel claimed to be the Yarmouth coming to anchor.
So there's more deception by the Germans. The Jemchug is actually a very interesting vessel as far as its history. Let's take a look at that. So here you go, the Russian cruiser Jemchug, meaning pearl. And yes, this is on Wikipedia. My thoughts on Wikipedia are basically that you shouldn't take everything said on Wikipedia as gospel, but at the same time, much of it is very well sourced, and so you can kind of use it as a jumping off point for further research. But so the Jemchug, laid down in 1901, commissioned 1904, took part in the Russo-Japanese War, and was there at the famous Battle of Tsushima, in which the Russian fleet was totally annihilated by the Japanese. And the Jemchug took 17 hits during the battle, but somehow survived. It was one of the few ships to survive from the Russian fleet, ends up being repaired in Vladivostok and later returned to active service. And here it is, just under a decade later, now taking part in a major battle of the First World War. And important to note that the commander of Jemchug was not on board at this moment. He was ashore as the Jemchug was at Penang for service, and so the commander was staying at a hotel on Penang Island at the time of the battle. So that is important to note as we head here into the combat.
The bluff allowed Muller to navigate his ship to a strategic firing position merely 300 yards from the target. The Russian cruiser's guard, however, detected a telltale sign, the foremost funnel trembling, shouting a warning. A shot was fired, missing its mark. Then, Müller ordered the torpedo officer to launch a retaliation.
So some of these Russians not fooled by the deception, but is it too late?
Simultaneously, Emden unleashed a relentless barrage, striking the Russian cruiser below the after funnel. The torpedo hit the Russian cruiser's port quarter, flooding the engine room. The cruiser's deck soared from the explosion and crumbled. Emden continued its onslaught, turning the sides of the Jemchug into a sieve. Unsatisfied with the uncertainty of the cruiser's fate, Müller commanded a second torpedo, hitting under the bridge. As Jemchug listed heavily, Emden continued its assault. A broadside, then another, further crippled the sinking cruiser. In a tragic state, engulfed in flames, a colossal explosion ensued, leaving only a masthead when the smoke lifted. Müller, regretfully acknowledging the devastation, made a prudent decision to depart promptly, foreseeing potential confrontation with other vessels. The Jemchug, battered by relentless shelling, succumbed to the Emden's onslaught, leaving 91 officers and men dead and 121 wounded. The noise of battle had alerted other vessels in the harbor. The French torpedo cruiser d'Iberville and destroyer Fronde had sprung into action. Rapidly approaching, they fired salvos against the Emden. Not able to gain enough speed to come within range, they did not pose a threat. As Emden sped away, a British steamer, the unarmed SS Glenturret, was intercepted near the approach buoy. However, before the Emden's boarding party could complete their mission, an unexpected threat emerged, an unknown warship approaching from the northwest.
And you wonder if the boarding party had been able to complete their mission if Muller would have gotten away with Glenturret and commandeered it to his own cause as he had done with some of these other ships.
The Glenturret was allowed to proceed into Penang, carrying von Müller's apologies for the inadvertent firing on the unarmed launch. The unknown vessel was swiftly identified
So it looks like he may have been trying to sink it.
as a French destroyer, the Mousquet. As the destroyer approached, Müller ordered his men to open fire. The Emden fired multiple salvos, rapidly reloading to continue the bombardment. Commander Felix Therouan's destroyer valiantly resisted, but the Emden had scored several direct hits. As the engine room flooded with water, the Mousquet succumbed in a mere 10 minutes. Emden's boats were deployed to rescue survivors. In total, 47 men were lost, including Commander Therouan. 36 were wounded. By 8 a.m., Emden embarked on a northwesterly course, eluding a pursuing French destroyer in a sudden rain squall. The Pistolet, chasing the Emden until 10 a.m., slowed due to an overheated bearing.
And remember, at least in the case of Jemtchug, some of these vessels that Muller has now sunk or damaged were some of those pursuing him. So that's going to allow him to get away more easily as well.
Fronde, trailing the Pistolet, had even less success. By the time the d'Iberville limped out on one engine, she could only search for Mousquet survivors. Once again, Emden had vanished, prompting the Allies to ponder their fortune in losing no more than the Jemtchug and the Mousquet that morning. However, Emden's journey, fraught with unforeseen challenges, was far from over.
Hard to call that a fortunate outcome for the Allies.
Thank you very much for watching this video. Please leave a like, it really helps out the channel.
Wow, and House of History is just amazing. Let's take a look at what the final fate was for Muller and the SMS Emden. Okay, so after Penang, Muller then took Emden to raid the Cocos Islands. He then was confronted by an Australian cruiser, the Sydney, and took heavy damage, eventually running his ship aground to avoid sinking. Lost pretty close to half of his crew in that encounter. And the survivors were mostly taken prisoner. Looks like some of them did commandeer an old schooner and eventually returned to Germany, which is pretty impressive. That had to be an incredibly arduous journey. Let's see if we can find out what happened to the captain, Muller. So after the defeat of the Emden by the Australians, Muller and those who had survived, so Muller does not go down with the ship there, was captured, taken prisoner, and it looks like transferred to the British at Malta. The detachment that commandeered that schooner and made their way back to Germany apparently had been part of a shore party and were not on board at the time of the sinking. So they were marooned over there, and like I said, it had to have been an incredibly arduous journey back to Germany for that part of the crew. Muller himself was put in an officer's prisoner of war camp, separate from his enlisted men. And how about this? He leads an escape of 21 prisoners through a tunnel, but was recaptured as he then was repatriated to Germany after the war and given the Pour le Mérite, the highest military honor from the German government, and later ends up being elected to the Parliament of Brunswick. eventually dying in 1923 in Germany. So what a journey it was for Mueller, for the whole crew of the Emden, and what an incredible run they had there in the latter portion of 1914, just on a rampage through the Indian Ocean Rim and Southeast Asia. All right, so be sure to check out House of History. This channel is just getting better by the day. Absolutely incredible stuff that they're doing, and they absolutely deserve your view. Subscribe to them. Give us a subscribe. Help us build our reaction channel. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Alex. I am out.